Boots, the chemist, Rolls-Royce here in Derby, Thornton's the chocolate makers. We've certainly got some well-known brands here in the East Midlands. But there was another company in Colville which could match those big names. And in its heyday, it was a manufacturing giant. What was it? Well, we sent Des Coleman to Toy Town to find out.
If you were a kid in the 70s or 80s, the chances are your Christmas present was made by this company in Colville. There's a whole load of toys like Star Wars stuff, Care Bears, remember Action Man? But behind the action figures and cuddly toys, there's a tale of marketing masterminds and a corporate strategy that would ultimately close the company in the UK. I'm going to explore the rise and the demise of Palitoy, one of Britain's favourite toy makers and a local legend. It all began in Leicester, way back in 1919. Back then, toys were a sideline for Castleloyd, a large plastics factory. The heady days of Palitoy were on the horizon, and one man who played an important part was chief toy designer Bob Breakin. Working for Palitoy, what was it like?
Oh, it was a great company to work for. When you look back at it in hindsight, you think, well, it was a bit more than a job. It was providing toys for children for enjoyment, and for play and everything. And now it's providing enjoyment for adults, for collecting.
Because you're a part of people's history.
Yeah, it's part of history, yeah. I mean, you can see it around here, can't you?
I remember seeing those Palitoy cards on the shelves and I was taken to the supermarket as a young child and going, oh yeah, tugging on mum's seat, oh mum, I want this new figure, I want this new figure. She's like, oh, you know, trying to drag me away sort of thing.
You just grow up and you want to relive that, and it just takes you back to when you were that young. And I think that's worth its weight in gold more than anything. So.
The Palitoy name was a nod to Alfred Pallet, the company founder. And during the post-war years, it had some great selling products, manufacturing everything from beach balls to dolls. Plastic was a fantastic product for making toys, and with sales strong, the business expanded. It attracted attention from overseas. In 1968, Palitoy, which was based here, was sold to the American food giant General Mills, who already owned other large toy producers. In the 70s, it meant expansion, over 1,000 staff and sales topping 20 million. It was boom time for Toy Town, Colville. I'm visiting the old factory with some former employees. It's been 30 years since they've been back.
The buildings are the same, obviously things are different, but for me personally, it's a very strange experience being back here after all that time.
It's a huge part of your life, isn't it, this?
Yes, it was, yes. And it was probably the most enjoyable part of my life, and far and away the most enjoyable job I've ever had.
Dolls were always big business, and arguably Palitoy's finest was made for a boy. But you could never call this chap a doll. He was an action figure. Launched in the UK in the mid-1960s, Action Man was originally based on the American toy G.I. Joe.
In '67 I joined Palitoy and I started to redesign the whole range, so it was British. Yeah. So we put in things like Land Rover, Scorpion tank and things like that.
But not just redesigned, this is one of the most famous parts of an Action Man, is that get off me, get off me, get off me, is that sort of Kung Fu grip. You designed that, didn't you?
Kung Fu grip, that's the American name. We call it the gripping hand.
The gripping hand.
And I actually sculpted that hand based on that one.
Yeah. Just like Action Man, many toys made in Colville were manufactured under license, which meant Palitoy produced someone else's original idea and then paid for the privilege. You were one of the gentlemen responsible for building the brand in the 70s, weren't you?
That's right, yeah, we were, and in the 60s. I mean, Star Wars was a big brand, but it was all controlled from the States. We had far more fun to develop things of our own, like Girls' World, Striker, mainline railways, things that we controlled from beginning to end.
These British ideas sold well, but Star Wars outsold everything, and action figures which were originally in the shops for £1.50 now fetch an eye-watering amount amongst collectors. And this is what I find hard to believe, Simon. This really is the holy grail of toy collection, isn't it? Because ounce rounds, these Palitoy figures are probably worth more than gold.
They certainly are. The week before last, we actually sold a figure of Boba Fett, who was in the first Star Wars film, for £18,000.
£18,000?
Yes.
Is that some sort of record then?
It's a world record and the highest figure yet paid for an action toy.
Besides toy auctions, there's also vintage toy shops all over the country, trading in Palitoy products. One in Leicester has recently discovered an archive of Palitoy pictures. Now, you've got a great collection of photos here. I brought Bob along to take a look at them, but tell me a little bit about these photos.
These photos came off an ex-Palitoy employee. Her mother worked for Palitoy back when it was Castleloyd, and she continued to work for them as well. So what we can make out, most of them are from the sort of mid-60s to the probably early 70s at the latest.
Bob, I've never seen a bloke so excited looking over photos. What is that?
Well, it's amazing. These are amazing. I've just spotted this one over here. That's the first toy I worked on at Palitoy in 1967. I designed the spray mask for that animal, and I spotted Action Man here.
Yeah.
And this photo here is 66, when Action Man won the Toy of the Year award.
Palitoy, for me, it's the history of the company, the heritage, as well as silly little things like the actual logo. I love that logo. Maybe it's because it's part of my childhood and it's something I look back on. That's what nostalgia is, isn't it? But essentially, we look back on something and go, oh, that was nice.
But after the highs came the lows, and by the early 80s, Palitoy was producing many of its toy parts in China. It was a cheaper process and unfortunately spelt the beginning of the end. The global toy industry was anything but child's play. It was big business, which meant acquisitions, mergers, and company buyouts. With plastics production being sent overseas, operations in Colville were winding down, and by 1982, 450 jobs had been cut. What was it like at the end?
Sad, because a lot of friendships were going to be lost. People had worked here from being very young, and in a lot of cases, their children worked here with them.
When I started, it was a great place to work with. When I left, it wasn't as good because we were dictated to from the States, so it hadn't got the same feel at all.
Palitoy finally closed its doors in 1986. Some of its toys are now being produced by new firms and its remaining stock sold on. But to wrap up this story, I've come to Quorn in Leicestershire, where the legend lives on. This was a company that produced dozens of big names in its time, from Tressie to Tiny Tears, Spirograph to Star Wars. But for many, Action Man is how it'll always be remembered. It's the annual gathering for this action figure, and a nice way to end our toy story.
My partner's 45, he's still living and playing with his action men, so it's an opportunity for him to still indulge in that.
Can I interest you in this? Go on, seriously, look. Have a play with that. Go on.
It's got to be one of the best for its time. I think nowadays they would struggle to sell the sort of Action Man type figures, but because of the way everything's changed with electronics and gaming, but I think for its time it was well ahead of its game.
Our very own Action Man, Des Coleman, bringing back some happy memories. But that's it from Derby for this week. Next Monday, a housing special.